some water before we start? Who are joining us online. I am TRACEY WEISSGERBER, and I study meta-research, or the science of science, at the Quest Center for Responsible Research at the Berlin Institutes of Health and Charité. And as you all know, the focus of this evening's panel is on the impact of diversity on research quality, exploring the knowledge gap. This is a very complex and challenging topic, but don't worry, because we have 5 excellent panelists who are joining us this evening who have agreed to help us sort through all of these very complicated problems and solve them within the next 75 minutes. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists for taking on that extremely difficult task. And I'm going to introduce our panelists to you now. Seated to my left, we have Lydia RHYMAN, who is a computational chemist at the University of Mauritius and a member of the Global Young Academy. To her left, we have Dr. MARIETTA AUER, who is a vice president of the German Research Foundation, a professor of private law and international and interdisciplinary foundations of law at the Universität Gießen und Frankfurt, and director at the Max Planck Institute for Legal History and Legal Theory. To her left, we have Dr. ISOLDE KARLE, vice director of diversity, inclusion, and talent development, and professor of practical theology at Ruhr-University Bochum. And to her left, our final panelist in the room tonight is Dr. Gerttraud Stadler, director of the Institute of Gender in Medicine and professor of gender-sensitive research, or prevention research at Charité. I'd like to thank all of those panelists for joining us. In addition, we have one panelist who will be joining us online, who will appear behind me shortly via magic. So I would like to thank very much Dr. Gauri Gopalakrishna for joining us, and she is involved in the Dutch National Survey on Research Integrity and is an epidemiologist at Maastricht University and the Amsterdam University Medical Center. So thank you all for being here. Our discussion this evening is going to focus on the impact of diversity on research quality. And shortly, I'll begin by asking our speakers to help us each understand what each of these 2 very complex terms mean. But before we do that, I'd like you to draw your attention to the limitations of hosting an in-person panel on this topic. This is a global conversation, and yet there are clear systemic biases to who can be in the room in person in Berlin to discuss this with us this evening. So to address this barrier, we held an online unconference earlier in the week where researchers, administrators, and funders shared their research perspectives and lived experience. And this unconference was joined by researchers in many fields and countries around the world, including Brazil, Macedonia, Bangladesh, Australia, Germany, Scotland, and the United States and Canada. Dr. RHYMAN was involved in organizing this event, and she has accepted graciously the challenge of sharing both her own perspectives as well as some of the knowledge that was brought to our attention during the event by scholars around the world. And I'd also like to mention that we are delighted to be joined by the online audience around the world, and we look forward to broadening our discussion with questions from that audience later, as well as questions from those in the room. So I'd like to now begin our panel discussion, since we have many problems to solve and not much time to do it. So I'd like to direct the first question to Dr. KARLE. And what do we mean when we talk about diversity in research teams, and what aspects of diversity are especially important when we're thinking about research quality?
Big question. Thank you so much. First of all, what do we mean by diversity? Gender, class, and race are the main categories, but we also talk about age diversity, ethnic diversity, religious diversity, and in physical ability. So diversity is also in how people think. Diversity recognizes and values the differences in a group and between the groups, because we are not just only individuals, but profoundly shaped by our culture, by our family background. And and what does this have to do with science? there are a lot of groups there are great talents that cannot develop because prejudice and bias prevent them from doing so. And a science system that is concerned with attracting the best minds and the best people cannot afford that. Therefore, it is not only an imperative of equal opportunity, but also in line with the logic of the science system to promote diversity. We need to foster these talents whose potential is undiscovered so far because they have not been encouraged to pursue a scientific career. So we think of women, but also now in these days of first academic students, first generation students, international students, black students, and so forth. And that's why I think it's really important to promote diversity in research terms. And studies show that gender diverse teams, for instance, produce more innovative and higher impact scientific ideas than homogeneous teams. And in selection processes, homogeneous composed committees come to similar decisions because they just share the same values and perspectives. And it's really important to have more different perspectives, and so that risky projects do not tend to be evaluated negatively. Review groups, that's why I'd say, need to be more diverse in peer review and in our appointment committees, because we cannot see what we cannot see. We tend to favor the people who are similar to us, and we tend to have more negative perspective on people that are unfamiliar to us. This dynamic is described as unconscious bias, and that's why it's really important. What is unconscious, we cannot reflect. So that's why it's important to reflect about unconscious bias and the consequences unconscious bias has. So that's my first answer.
Thank you very much. You passed. Okay, so I'd like to go to Dr. RHYMAN to help us expand this conversation. We had some very interesting conversations during the unconference where we went around rooms of people from all different countries and says, what does a diverse research team look like in your field and country? And we got completely different answers. So can you tell us a little bit about how researchers in different regions and in different fields might think differently about what constitutes a diverse research team?
Indeed, we had a very interesting discussion during the virtual unconference. Well, the diverse team, it differs across discipline, as most of you will agree with me. Whereas when we consider a STEM field, let us say, for example, chemistry, which is my area of expertise, a diverse team will mean that we have different team members with different identities, maybe based on the social background, different cultural background, ethnic group, race, and so on. Whereas if we consider the field involving human studies, such as behavioral sciences, human psychology, social sciences, where data collection is required, diversity in this case means including participants with different culture, social background, caste, race, gender, ethnic group, among others, and also underrepresented groups, minorities, and so on. But the majority, what we have, based on our discussion, we have discussed that the majority of studies use the WEIRD participant. What is WEIRD participant? It is, the acronym WEIRD stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. It is an acronym which is basically used in the psychology field. And this is a challenge because non-WEIRD participants are excluded. For instance, if we consider a particular study where only WEIRD participants were considered, and we try to reproduce the same study in a non-WEIRD with non-WEIRD participants in countries such as, let us say, India or any Asian country or any African country, we will not obtain the same research findings because we have not taken into consideration the cultural difference and all. So to ensure validity and accuracy and reliability of research findings, it is important to include both WEIRD and non-WEIRD participants.
Thank you. All right, so I'd like to move on now to our second dimension, which is research quality, and I'd like to explore that with Dr. AUER and Dr. Gopalakrishna. When we talk about research quality, what do we mean by that, and who is it that defines research quality? And definitions can differ across fields, so I would ask our participants to let us know if they're talking about a field-specific dimension. We will perhaps go to Dr. AUER first, followed by Dr. Gopalakrishna.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, of course, research quality is very, very highly field-specific. And specifically, there is a big difference between the whole field of natural sciences, where the last years have shown an incredible dimension, or an incredible move into the dimension of metrics, which is always a bit at odds with the social sciences and the humanities. However, I have a broad overview, sort of being one of the vice presidents of the German Research Foundation, so we have to sort of get an overall map of what can be meant by research quality, so we try to define this. Maybe a couple of observations. One observation would be that quality doesn't necessarily equal or can be in some sort of a, attention with excellence, because excellence is a competitive measure. And again, this very much points to metrics. So when you look into metrics, this can be potentially diverse hindering, because if you look what articles are cited most, then you have research which clearly shows that diverse candidates or diverse dimensions are underrepresented in metrics. So we look at quality, and so the German Research Foundation tries to make a very big and broad picture here. Something which is important to note is that we are sort of not putting this or defining this top down, but this is very much bottom up. The scientists and the fields define what is quality in their fields, and that is, of course, very diverse across fields. It's very much something which has to do, and then you can sort of diversify again, and you can say, well, we have like primary quality measures, which is methods, depth of inquiry, originality, creativity, and then we have adjunct factors which also add to quality, and that diversity is absolutely an issue here. Then there is something like so it's a multifaceted concept, and it's of course an open decision or an open question how this will be defined in the future years, and this is something we are always concerned with.
Okay, Dr. Gopalakrishna.
Sure, thanks, Tracy. Just an observation of mine, since we are talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, the panel is definitely dominated by women. So I wonder if that was was that intended, or that's a question for you? Just my observation, actually, looking at the panel. But I'll jump straight in and just give my 2 cents from research quality. So speaking from the life and biomedical sciences, which is the discipline that I am from, then we're really actually talking about internal and a study that's been done. So how accurate or valid is it, to the study population? The study findings speaks to its internal validity and external validity to the. So just looking at it, with those lenses, that's typically how we would define research quality. And then, of course, there's the research integrity perspective. So really, the integrity of the study on which differ according to disciplinary fields. So what is the best practice in biomedical sciences may not necessarily actually be the best practices in a different discipline. So this can really actually be discipline specific. I think that is also where we want to talk about the fact that research quality in and of itself, in terms of its definition, can differ, whereby we talk these epistemic differences as also being part of the definition that should include it in inclusivity and diversity. Traditionally, at this point in time, while that is, slowly becoming more and more a topic of discussion, especially of research integrity circles, still it is very much dominated by the life and biomedical science, where definitions are very much being driven to add epistemic discipline differences to the call for inclusivity and diversity.
All right, thank you. I'd like to bring Dr. Stadler into the discussion. So we've heard about many factors that influence who becomes a researcher and what role they might play within the research team. So I'm wondering, how can the identity of the researcher and their position within the research team influence the type of research that is done and the quality of that research?
Well, first of all, we have massive data gaps. So we don't really have that many excellent answers to that. One of the very solid examples that we have is that, for example, if women are senior authors on a paper, they do look at gender differences more. So there's a difference in the questions that people ask based on their identities. We also have people who, for example, have lived experience with certain medical conditions, ask very different questions from those that don't have these conditions. So, so to me, I would make a very strong case for that, including diverse lived experiences that are relevant to the research topic is really an essential part of research excellence. So people with different identities ask different questions. And so one thing is just, of course, we want to make the best use of all talents that we have. So at the moment, by excluding so many people, especially also internationally, whole regions, due to lack of educational opportunities and academic access, cannot actually contribute to our scientific knowledge. And we could just imagine how different our sciences would look like if everybody could contribute. But we don't have that at the moment. So this is really an underuse of talent. But the other thing is also, by including diversity and gender questions systematically in research, I would think that we get much better diversified innovations. So we get very much more innovative questions. And by that, we really could revolutionize science. So by really not filling the data gaps regarding research teams, but also regarding including heterogeneity in our research questions, we are really missing out, I think. And so to me, it's kind of interesting because I would add so we've done, within the Berlin University Alliance here and also with our international collaborators, we've done a little exercise. I'm in medicine, yeah, so in the health sciences. And so which diversity domains matter there? Well, definitely the patient experiences, yeah, so that is kind of a no-brainer. We do always have to include those, and research teams need to kind of seek that out actively. Because we cannot expect our research teams to always include that. Yeah? So we get patient advisory boards, things like that. But then, so we think that sex gender is probably also very important to usually include age and other visible markers like skin color. So race and region are very important. But then also what we haven't mentioned is care work. So our research teams somehow are composed a lot of people who do not have many care responsibilities or delegate those. Or also sexual identity seems to be something that is missing in our way we are conceptualizing diversity. So, and also what we've discovered when we started talking about diversity, so sometimes it's really a narrow definition, but we would rather like to broaden it. Yeah. And say, like, so for example, include also first-generation academics. And then we found in a student survey at the Charité here in Berlin that only 7% of our students do not have at least one, are not affected at all. So in a way, I think by more systematically looking at that, we can make the most of our talents, make the most of our lived experiences, and have much better research, I think.
Yeah, and I think one point that is really important to consider is it's not just about who is doing the research, it's about who benefits. And so when we're saying that there are regions that aren't represented, that aren't contributing to the research that's being done, those are also regions that are less likely to benefit from the research that's being done. And the world has big problems everywhere that we need to solve. Okay, so we've heard examples from both Dr. Stadler and Dr. KARLE about the scientific evidence and what it tells us about the ways in which diversity and diverse teams can impact on research quality. I'm wondering if there are other examples that our other panelists might like to share, or if any of our panelists might like to comment on evidence gaps, places where we need information about this issue and we haven't done the studies and we don't have that information yet. All right, so we'll go Dr. Stadler first and then Dr. AUER.
Yeah, so far our evidence is mostly on women versus men, very binary conceptualization of mostly research teams. Yeah, so, and even there we have massive gaps. Yeah, so for example in Corona, yeah, so COVID-19, we had more severe trajectories and higher mortalities in mortality in men. Still, and then women were had a much higher psychosocial burden. Still, a tiny fraction of studies even reported, provided gender disaggregated data. So this is kind of like scandalous, right? We know this matters, and in a way this is bad research quality. But so if for gender, we are still doing best, right? So what I think what's really missing is, and then the other diversity domains usually are studied in a very siloed manner. There are people who look at social determinants of health, there are people who look at race and ethnicity, or regions, or age, but they are usually not looking at these factors together and in an intersectional manner. And I think this is really kind of something we need to do better at, and we need to do it much more systematically.
Right.
Yeah, I agree, and I'd like to add that yeah, sort of the classic equal opportunities dimension, at least in this country, is women, men. So that's easy, yeah. But then there are all these other issues, and lots of the literature and also the studies we have are actually from the US context, and there, of course, the race question is very big. However, this cannot be transported into this country one by one, because here sort of racial or ethnic diversity issues are totally different in a way. So this cannot be like transplanted. And then we already heard a lot of other issues like first generation academics, sexual orientation, and so in the end we end up with almost everybody concerned in some or the other dimension of diversity, which leaves us a lot of intersectionality issues with again resulting questions which become so complex that sometimes we don't even know what question to ask. Now, on the level of the German Research Fund, last year we broadened the definition of equal treatment from women, men, only to diversity at large, but we didn't offer a definition because we just don't know what factors to put into it. So the question would be to the universities, to the members of the German Research Foundation, to deliver the data, and they also don't have the data sometimes, partially also because of data protection concerns, because lots of people don't want to share issues like, yeah, disability, for instance. You can't just go and ask, yeah? So it's very, very complex. And when you start looking at intersectionality questions, then also it becomes very difficult to devise testable questions. So how should you measure those complex questions? How do you know that you don't measure just the wrong set of questions or the wrong set of factors because you just didn't see them? Mm-hmm. And I might like to add one more point. There's a colleague from mine of the Max Planck Society, Steven Vertovec, who coined the term super diversity. So he's arguing that we're actually, at least in the West, but maybe globally, at a point where sort of the little boxes of diversity criteria don't work anymore. So we have something which is cross-cutting. So we have like fluid identities which cannot be compartmentalized anymore. And also migration, it's also reflecting sort of the current migration dynamics worldwide. And what we heard here about the classic weird people of the West, which is just not the picture we have, or at least the trajectory to the future will be that this is just not the candidates we have here. So again, it's very, very hard to frame a research question which is testable. So I think that's sort of basically at at the heart of the data gap, and that's where research needs to be done.
Do any of our other panelists have anything to add on this point?
I think it's really important that we develop a monitoring at the university so that we know what we are talking about. So we just made a study at the Ruhr-Universität in Bochum, and just to see how many students are, for instance, heterosexual, homosexual, or whatever. How many students? That of course that students didn't have to participate, but they wanted to, and how many, for instance, first-generation students we have. And then we discovered that we, at the Ruhr University, we have more than half of the students are first-generation students, and that's really something. And just to realize that, and to realize what challenges are given with that. A lot of our first-generation students, they have an international family background, and a lot of our students are economically really they count themselves to the poorest or second poorest group in Germany, 40%. So, and just to see they have special burdens or special challenges they have to deal with, and it's not to compare with a middle class student from. And I think it's really important to gather all these information so that we have a basis, a foundation where we can develop then a research and to think about diversity strategies that could be really helpful. So this is not mainly about research, but just by promoting students who do not feel at ease at the university because they do not know the code there, how you speak there, or how you address a professor, or they do not have the right habitus, and just to have offers like we have a talent scouting and also groups where you can share experiences just to empower each other and not to feel lost at the university. This is not so much about research, but just to promote the environment for the diverse students that we have, and not just to think very much in standards. And I think that's neurodiversity is a big challenge too. And so this is for education and the university. It's really a big thing, and it's of course it's not easy to handle it in times where you don't have resources or where the resources are not really big. But I think that's the basis to develop more diversity than in science too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think as you're talking about the challenges for students in Germany who are part of the lower economic classes, it's also important to remember how much magnified those challenges can be for students who are coming from outside of Germany, from completely different cultural contexts and social contexts, and who may also be visible minorities or have another identity that's underrepresented in science. Okay, so I want to address next a common objection to diversifying the research workforce. And sometimes we will hear that diversity is actually a threat to quality and to the meritocracy. And people who argue this may say that we should select the best people and it doesn't matter who they are. And yet we've heard many examples in the virtual unconference about how things that we associate with merit are actually examples of privilege. And they reflect access to resources, to networks, and to decision-making power, as well as other things. And so I'd like to start with Dr. Gopalakrishna on what you think about this issue.
Thanks, Tracy. I think we briefly went a little bit over this this morning, but just to reiterate my point of view, my personal position is that I don't think that meritocracy needs to be replaced when we talk about EDI issues. And I think that when we talk about hiring based on excellence, based on merit. These are usually systems that are operating in places where there already is awareness and governance structures to try to address EDIs and trying to expand the talent pool that is available through sustained structures and standards. And I think one of the most common examples of this is trying to reduce the gender gap in various different forms, from seniority to pay. So I think that it is merit, and meritocracy works very well in societies where there is this awareness for EDI issues. However, it needs, as we already discussed in the panel, to be expanded beyond gender. When it comes to a lot of the other regions of the world, I think that merit in that case is indeed a privileged system. And I think we need to go back to actually look at, the basis upon which the standards and structures to be hired based on excellence or merit. These are generally being created in situations that are already inequitable and biased against these marginalized populations. So seen from that perspective, I certainly do agree it's an extension of privilege. And I think that there have been different ways of trying to address this through quota systems, although with its own imperfections. It is one way of trying to break the cycle of privilege versus poverty or lack of resources, giving dedicated scholarships to certain groups. I think that these are ways which have been put in place to try to expand the diversity of the pool upon which we need to ensure is representative of our society. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's an either or argument. I think that it depends on the kind of context in which we're talking about merit.
Yeah, and I think that's a bit of a challenging issue because on the one hand, we can say within this context it may work, but on the other hand, the research workforce is highly mobile. And researchers, for example, from the Global South are often applying to positions to funding agencies that are located within the Global North. And so when the playing field isn't level across the board, that's a huge issue for the mobility of those researchers, for the ability of those researchers to be recognized and seen. So I'd like to go to Dr. KARLE now. What are you thinking about this issue of, is the meritocracy a myth? Is it working? Does it not work? What are your thoughts?
I just already mentioned that for me, a diversity strategy is a very good instrument to promote highly talented people who haven't been encouraged to promote a scientific career so far. In this direction, I would say diversity is fostering quality, research quality. But of course, there are some, in the reality, there are some dangers or risks. And when diversity strategies are used just for identity politics, for instance, and so the politics is in the forehand and not research work, then that's a problem, or that could be a problem. And so, and furthermore, I mean, in order to make a diversity politic, you have to make differences and differences. I mean, on the one hand, we stabilize differences when we just name them, but in the end, we would like to destabilize these differences because we say it's about talent and not about male, female, black, white, and so forth. So this is sort of a paradox we have to live with, and there is no, in the best of all worlds, maybe there's a solution, but I cannot see that right now.
Mm-hmm. Dr. RHYMAN, what do you think?
Yeah, so I tend to think about equity in research. So what is equity in research? It means to normalize resources. That is in terms of funding, infrastructure, equipment, instrument, and so on. But from a Global South perspective, this is a real challenge. Because let us remember that from a Global South perspective, we have limited funding, we have limited resources. Along with that, there are other issues. For example, we have load shedding issues in many countries in the Global South. We don't have access to all the journals because universities can't afford to subscribe to all the different publishers as well. And we cannot publish as open access because we don't have the funding for that. So these are the issues that usually countries from the Global South face. Now, if I have to consider a lead researcher from a global north who has a better access to resources, to instrument, maybe they have the latest instrument or equipment as well, even access to mobility. So this is considered as meritocratic. So as you can see, if you compare a researcher from a global south and a researcher from a global north, it is an inequitable system. Yeah. So does that mean, in terms of research quality, if we have to talk about it, obviously the one from the global north will have a better research quality compared to the one from a research south. But does that mean that research from the global south is of poor quality just because of limited resources and funding? I think this is a very interesting point that we need to ponder over.
Mm-hmm. And so that raises an interesting question. One of the things that we talked about in the unconference is in cases where quality requires resources, how do we implement quality and advocate for quality in a way that it does not become a barrier to diversity, where those who have more resources are being recognized for doing higher quality work and those who have fewer resources are therefore evaluated as having lower quality. I'm wondering if any of our panelists would like to address that complicated issue.
Well, so I absolutely in fields where resources are needed to do simply do research. Yeah? So in a way that this applies always. Yeah? We need to have educational resources and some free time and space. So it's always like a little bit of a privileged situation is necessary to conduct any research at all, kind of Virginia Woolf's room of one's own. Yeah? So why we do need some space and headspace as well to do research. But in a way, I've also seen in collaborations that cut across resource-richer and research-poorer areas that innovation flows both ways. So that from the research-poorer areas, a lot of local, very good solutions that do not require such, in medicine especially. Yeah? So you can use them also for resource-richer environments. And so it is not, so I completely agree where I think in the natural sciences, where we need a lot of, it's really resource intensive, there will always be a disadvantage. But on the other hand, we have a lot of areas where we could make much more together. And so kind of to foster these collaborations would be possible. Then the question is like, so how do we do this? Like, so what I've seen what works is kind of like collaborations that are very focused. Yeah? So that you, for example, say, I'm collaborating with a certain country, because in research we also need to take the local context into account. And a lot of our research solutions are not especially transferable. Yeah? So, for example, what does ethnicity mean and what kinds of ethnicity matter really varies dramatically from region to region. And how that matters for health as well. So we, I think we can learn from each other through collaboration, but at the same time we do have to have deep roots in our regions to, for example, fully understand the healthcare system. So we cannot just transplant solutions and resources from one area to the other. We have to adapt those. And so to forge, and a lot of this really relies on personal connection. Yeah? So to me, it's kind of interesting. Like, so how do we do that? And yeah, so I think I don't have good solutions, but I think we could do much better. If everybody kind of like would also pick an additional region, like what we have with city partnerships, for example. And so have those between resource richer and resource poorer areas. I think that would be very advantageous.
So I'd like to get Dr. RHYMAN's perspective on this. What is collaboration that is responsible, that is respectful, that is advancing science and advancing skills for both partners look like when we're thinking about countries with limited research funding versus countries with a lot of research funding?
Yeah, this one I can share my own personal experience. So usually collaboration, this is what we do in the group that I am, where we do collaborate with many different teams across the world, and it is really fruitful, and this is how we have become very productive as well. So this is one way. But at times, most of the times, we do try to collaborate informally, because it is through personal contact, like you have just mentioned, and so on. But if we try to formalize a collaboration, you know, you have so many administrative work, you have the agreement, and so on. By the time that you are agreeable on a common agreement and so on, this takes quite a while to be able to do so. And also, you have to be very specific about the number of authors and so on. So this is quite an issue. But at times, even if you have an informalized collaboration, you have some ups and downs. At times, it doesn't work. For example, quite recently, we have been collaborating with someone, but unfortunately, it didn't work, although that we were already working on that. For example, they submitted their work without even us knowing about it. So you see, this is because of an informal collaboration. So it really depends. We have to have a responsible collaboration. And also, well, you can have many different research teams that can be considered as diverse, where we are including almost everyone. But are we really inclusive? So that is the next question that we need to ask ourselves, because everyone's voice needs to be heard at the table. We need to listen to everyone so as to feel included.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to stick with Dr. RHYMAN now before we move on to others. So can you offer your perspective on why it's so important to have research that's driven by researchers from the Global South?
Yes. First of all, is to be inclusive within the scientific community. So this is the first point. The second point is that researchers from the Global South have made significant contribution despite all the challenges that they face. Thirdly, research from the Global South offers diverse perspectives that might be overlooked by the Global North. For example, conducting research on malaria, tuberculosis, AIDS, HIV, for example. This research needs to be conducted in regions where these diseases are prevalent in a more effective approach. And fourthly, there are lots of unexplored potential in the Global South. For example, Africa has a huge biodiversity resources that has the potential to provide novel and potent drug candidates, but remain largely unexplored due to limitation of research funding and resources. So this is something which is important to improve the health system, for example. Lastly, last but not the least, there is no lack of talent, but I think there is only lack of opportunity in that case.
Thank you. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about researchers and researchers themselves, but we all know that decisions about who does research, what research is conducted, the quality of that research, and whether or how that research is shared isn't simply made by researchers. So we have funders, we have leaders at research institutions, and we have publishers and editors as examples of other stakeholders that are influencing these decisions. And so I'd like to hear from our panelists how a lack of diversity amongst these other stakeholder groups shapes the research literature and influences who benefits from research. And I'd like to start with Dr. Gopalakrishna and then hear from Dr. AUER.
Thanks, Tracey. If I can actually just go back and maybe just add a point on responsible collaboration. I was really literally on the tip of my tongue was to mention these other stakeholders, primarily funders, I think can have a big role, influential role in being able to ensure that research that is being done in the Global South, that the roles of these different collaborators are indeed responsible partnerships that are formed. And I think that seeing at the last World Conferences on Research Integrity, the Cape Town statement really made a strong push to speak on the issue of responsible collaboration, particularly in the Global South, that helicopter research and ethics dumping are still prevalent issues that go on, where Global South partners, quote unquote, are often data collectors and not fully on board as collaborators who are included in terms of partnerships, authorships as one form of a legitimate partnership, but also in terms of building and transferring expertise. So I do strongly believe that funders have a strong role to play in this, given that that is a quintessential carrot that they hold for many research communities. And with respect to publishers, I think that there is a lot of movement and discussion about ensuring that peer review is equitable, that there is a diverse pool of reviewers, very similar arguments to why we need a diverse pool of researchers to improve research quality. I think that it's a mirrored effect. The argument goes both ways. In other words, that we also need a diverse pool of reviewers. And finally, I think that we also need to ensure that we are able to assess the different policies and governance structures that are put in place. So while they may be value-based, we talked about evidence gaps, I think it's important to not only institute these policies while trying to address these evidence gaps, but also to have the flexibility to change these policies as new evidence emerges.
Thank you very much. Dr. Auer, would you like to expand?
Yeah, I'd like to add, of course, funders are supremely important for fostering or hindering diversity, because if we say that the whole system of science is basically a weird practice that is a Western enterprise, it's all about merit, then putting funds into where the merit already is, of course, heightens those differences. So there is, and that is actually being done by the big funders here in Germany, at least, well, I can speak for the German Research Fund. That's why there is supreme awareness that this is an issue and that diversity has to be an important part of every single funding issue and decision. And that funding decisions, when they are sort of looked at a grand scale, this issue really has to be part of the picture so that the lens of the focus is narrowed. That having said, however, one thing is, and maybe this is something, actually it came up here a couple of times, even though quality needs resources, so funding is extremely important for quality and thus also for bringing diversity into quality, it's totally not the case that you just put money on researchers and you get quality or you get excellence. That's just not what follows. So actually in a big funding structure, there should be awareness, there has to be awareness, and that's something which is very necessary that research fields are aware of that quality can always grow grassroots, like from bottom to top, and then you have to look where it is, and that's actually something where the Global South can totally contribute to science here, and actually does so. So in my institute we have lots of researchers from the Global South. We do research in archives in the Global South, which is something which is totally enriching what we've done here in the humanities work up to now. And that can be done under totally different conditions. It opens up other questions which weren't on the landscape before, and there you don't, sometimes you don't need all this, you can do with a little funding, but you get a lot of results. So it's not such a simple picture. But of course, just to highlight this again, of course, funding is supremely important, and yes, diversity is a big issue, and we're actively into fostering it, definitely.
So I'd like to expand on one of the points you raised. You talked about funders and supporting quality, and one of the challenges with funders is in a lot of fields, and those fields can be at very different places in regards to their discussions about the criteria of quality. So often when you're talking to funders about encouraging them to make changes in your field, they'll say, well, that's your field, but we fund all this other stuff, and we can't move in just one field without having something that applies to everyone. And so how do we get around this challenge of being able to move forward in the fields that are ready and that we know absolutely need to make changes and where there are clear standards, while still allowing other fields to evolve at their own pace and have their own conversations?
Well, you have to have a very professional funding organization with top researchers doing their research in their as sort of meta research on how science is moving along and where it's moving. And there has to be openness and sort of not sitting there and just doing what's been done all along, but just sort of moving into new fields because seeing that fields are moving there. Then there is also something like in big funding decisions when you have all fields competing with one another. Of course, you have to have decision boards which are diversely, sort of have a diverse occupation where all fields are represented, and then you have those debates. You totally have those debates. Well, this is excellence for you, but that's not excellence here. So how do we talk about this? And that's something which is also very productive and which brings up new issues. Basically, every year something new comes up, and then actually this is also very teaching. You learn something. So yes, there are the fields, there are sort of compartments, and everybody has their research culture, but there is also something which unites all science. In a way, all scientists can talk to one another, because everybody is basically interested in the same, in finding out something new. Wherever this is, whoever does it, it's wherever it is on the world, and that is something very, this is driving science, and that's the spirit you have to get at when you try to do good funding.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I have a few more questions for our panelists, but we are also approaching the time where we'll be taking questions from the audience. So for those online, I would encourage you to submit your questions via the Slido. They are being monitored, and we'll have a chance to share some of those questions with our panelists soon. So I want to move towards exploring solutions and actions that we can take to increase the diversity of the research workforce. We've heard about some examples of solutions already, but are there evidence-based interventions that we know are effective, or are there things that we have tried that we know don't work, and so we should stop doing them?
Well, so from organizational development, we very clearly know that basically delegate these issues to diversify organizations do not work if they are really on a low organizational hierarchy level. So it really needs to be a strategic and a kind of like a task for everyone, but including the top. Yeah, so, and really to set clear goals and really monitor those quantitatively and systematically, we cannot do without. Often we find really, so the problem is these problems in defining diversity and also data protection here in Germany hamper our ability to describe the diversity that we have in the population, in our students, and then do our hierarchy levels mirror the talent that we have going into our academic institutions. But we need to do much better really understanding that and then come up with evidence-based interventions. So, for example, what we found, just like you described, that at the Charité we have about a quarter of our students are first-generation academics. That was totally surprising to us, and we have currently no services to them. For them. We also found that that we have a lot of people living with invisible diversity domains, including chronic disease, that we had no clue about. Yeah. And so, so we need to do much better in terms of really systematically monitoring diversity, gender and diversity, and then together with, in a participatory way, really develop interventions that work. what we have done so far works, I would say, extremely suboptimally. Yeah? To delegate this to some parts of the organization that have very little say over strategic decisions does not work. We know that.
All right, so there are other panelists that would like to comment on this? Okay, we'll start with Dr. Karle.
I think it's really helpful to establish unconscious bias trainings for management people, for appointment committees and professors, because a lot of people, they just they don't know that they are biased or that they have prejudices, and it's just helpful to think about it and to reflect it. This won't solve every problem, but it will help. And so we started with that, and we can see that that people are really surprised. And I thought I wouldn't be biased at all, and now I see that this is not true. So this helps, especially in selection committees. And the second thing is that I very much agree with you that I mean, I'm at the top as a prorector for diversity or vice president, and it's very important to have decentralized activities. I also always say that to the students and to the staff, I cannot do it for you, you must do it. And that's why we have a central and anti-discrimination officer, but we also have diversity officers in all the faculties, student officers, and it's much easier, especially for the students, just to talk with them because they are not afraid of going to the red or something like that. So I think it's really important to combine both, so governance plus these decentralized activities and officers. And then third, I think it's just a matter of empowerment. Just that, for instance, I always encourage the new professors that come to Bochum to talk with talented students, that they apply for a scholarship, for instance, just to talk with them. They need to be addressed, directly addressed. Because first-generation students don't think that they could apply for a scholarship at the Studienstiftung des deutschen Volkes. They never would do that. And so you have to encourage them to say, yeah, go for it, you can do that. So it's just a matter of everybody in the staff, of professors and teachers, lecturers, and for myself, I mean, I was the first academic student and woman. I grew up at the farm with 3 brothers, so feminism was sort of a strategy to survive. But I never would have had the courage to pursue an academic career if I wouldn't have spent a year in the US. Only in the US I was encouraged to do that, because first I experienced female professors. To my time there was no female professor in Tübingen I could listen to or talk to. And the second was that these female professors, they talked to me and said, yeah, just go for it, you can do that. And that was just, for me, so surprising. And without this experience, I never would have chosen to just make doctoral research work and then the whole path, you know. And my last point. I think that we need reliable and transparent career paths. We have a big discussion regarding this issue in Germany, because it's really a mess. We have these temporary contracts, and we have this, temporary contracts may be okay, but it's just so confusing in Germany because you don't have really career stages like it's common internationally. And that's why we develop now a career concept in Bochum that you are a doctoral and then postdoctoral and then assistant professor and associate professor, so that you really know what can be a career, an academic career. And I think this is really important too.
All right, you have 30 seconds because the bearer of audience questions is here.
Okay, let me just totally concur with that. Career possibilities is actually the most supreme issue we have. I'd say, yeah, diversity is super, but it needs to be managed and monitored. So if we don't know what we are doing, things might go wrong. And let me just use the last few seconds to mention one thing. Rigid quotas, especially since we're all women, this can have a real backfire. Because once you're there, you're always on the panel, you're always in the hiring committee, you're always in that committee, you're always in that committee, and you're the only woman on the faculty, so it means you have to do them all. And that's kind of, that's actually a downside. So this needs to be worked on. So how is diversity working for those people who are in the system and who do get the opportunities, but again, it has a downside. Well, thank you.
All right, so I'd like to thank all our panelists for that discussion. So joining the panel, we have Uli Deernagel, who is here to represent the questions from the online audience. And then we also have a microphone in the room for questions for people in the room. So I'll maybe go to Uli for the first question while audience members are deciding what they might like to ask, and we're getting a microphone to them.
In fact, we don't have a question from the audience. We have an online audience, but they are probably also still thinking about those questions. So the floor is open, and I already see several hands up. And so the first question goes to you in the back. There will be a microphone in a second.
Thank you so much for the wonderful discussion on this topic. Well, I would like to ask, if a professor or a senior academic person is trying to establish a research team, at what point, when you weigh you want to have a diverse research team and you are also interested in merit, how do you balance it? Knowing fully well that if you want a diverse research team, you might want to probably recruit people, researchers from the global south. And if you compare maybe the publication qualities and things like that, it might not, if you place it on the same pedestal, it might not be the same with a candidate from the global north. So how do you balance diversity and merit now?
Okay, would one of our panelists like to?
Shall I answer just from my own experience with having assembled such a team? I just know it when I see it. I know when I see research quality. And that's totally an open question, whether it comes from the global north or from the global south, and how they interact. So there are questions which are interesting both to the global north and basically to the whole world, like the foundations of property. Yeah. So what are property rights, for instance, in water or in air or climate, etc., etc. So I'm a lawyer, so I take this from the legal side, but nonetheless, so natural scientists is even easier. It's even more obvious that there are combining questions. So if you say you have a global issue or you have an issue which is really interesting to the world, then there is of course a person on the global south who has something to say about it. And that's how I picked a person. And I don't care whether like the publications are in the reviews, I'm interested in whether the research is interesting. And then we can grow together and the team forms. And that's how this is done.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have probably many more now that the online community gets active. So we have to be brief with questions and brief with answers. That was very good. So thank you. I'll just, before I'll move to you, I have one question coming in from Marina. And her question is, what do you think about establishing gender quotas in high hierarchy research positions? What can we do about the glass ceiling in science and academics? Anyone? TURU.
So, well, there's always this discussion. So quotas work and incentives work. Both of them work. The thing is so if we want to do it merit-based, then we need to start at the base. Yeah? So if we start with students and give them incentives or quotas, then we develop all talents that we have. Yeah? But if we start to apply the quotas only at the top, there can be a little bit of a problem. Yeah? So quotas need to apply to the whole pipeline, and really so that we reflect in higher levels really what we have coming in terms of talents. Yeah? And that's why both incentives work and quotas work. So we can use both.
Thank you. Now we have a question from the floor.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for this interesting panel, which I think we all violently agree with you. But coming back to maybe a barrier to forming diverse teams, having diverse study subjects, and this is a question, I guess, for Professor Stadler, but also for Professor Auer with her kind of legal head on. How do you, especially in the kind of German context, get about, and you touched on this, Professor Stadler, before, the data protection aspect that we have, obviously for very obvious historic reasons in this country, about people being open about more protected diversity dimensions, possibly.
So we've just run a number of studies using a diversity minimal item set, where we voluntarily ask people to self-identify. So there are a few principles for that, which is that there is always, for each diverse domain, the option to say, I choose not to answer. And I think that's very important to include that, so because people are very willing to answer one diverse domain, but maybe not the other. They find that too personal. The other thing is that we need to then really think about our research practices. So for example, we've just studied the Charité as a whole organization with its 20,000 plus people. So that requires a lot of trust. We are not analyzing the individual data ourselves. We have that done by an external collaborator who doesn't know the people. Because if I'm basically combining, let's say, 10 diversity domains, I'm at individual persons. So we cannot do that. Yeah? So I would recognize probably colleagues, and that's why we outsource that. So there's definitely a very strong level of data protection necessary. And if I could have a wish, then what I would really want to wish for is a diversity data safe haven, where we have kind of like an identifier for certain people, and then so we could use all kinds of multi-domain diversity assessment. But the data would never leave that diversity data safe haven. So I could link that personal identifier with, for example, mortality data or disease data, and then these are sent to the diversity data safe haven, are analyzed there, are never shared with anybody. I get a synthetical data slice as a researcher to develop the code. I send that to the diversity data safe haven, and out comes some results. And I think so. This, if I could wish for something, that would be kind of like amazing, because then we would kind of have the highest privacy protection, and at the same time, like we could really be much more, for example, do much better with small minoritized groups.
Dr. Auer, you address directly.
Just a very brief follow-up. Yes, totally, that's the way to go, is you do anonymous research and statistical research, so that's totally okay. I'm a bit skeptical about the safe havens for data where the data never leave. I don't know, so I don't know. But anyway, we do the same, and as long as you can't identify the people, you get the data. However, you have to ask the right questions, and that's the hard part, because what to ask and what to get back if you don't really know what's there in the first place. So it's an ongoing project.
Are there further questions from the floor? Yep.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the nice introduction, discussion. And I have a question about the equality based on my observation. So I work in the Institute of Pharmacy in Berlin, and I observe that there are more female students, let's say, than males. And then I don't know what's the reason. Okay, let's just assume that female students are they study harder or somehow, or maybe smarter than the males. And then does this mean that when you recruit someone, and then you only recruit the high quality students, let's say the female students, and then maybe it can cause further inequality, let's say? How do you balance between the merits and the, let's say, the diversity?
Who wants to take this one on?
Well, the German Research Foundation says you try to implement diversity by hiring the lesser represented gender. So it's not always women. So that means when you have which exists, there are fields where there are 80% women students or so, then you have the reverse problem and the reverse issue. And of course, then the men have a claim to diversity, sure.
There is we'll get to you in a second. There's a question coming in which I think touches upon an issue which has not been discussed so far. It comes from Katharina, and she asks, how can we recognize and acknowledge the efforts and expertise of researchers who invest their time, knowledge, and activism into diversity at universities?
Shall I try to answer this? So, well, this is a labor of love, right? So we are here, the enthusiastic few, but I really believe that we need to do much better. So this is a task for everyone who does research, to integrate diversity and gender analysis into their research content and diversify their research teams. If we remain with the enthusiastic few, we are not doing enough. And really we owe it to research quality to all do better and to rope in all the ones who are maybe less enthusiastic. And I do think there are a few incentives that we can use. Of course, it is much more fun to be more innovative. So that in itself can be quite rewarding, but we can't just rely on that. So definitely using incentives in additional to monitoring and quota and leadership, really, I think is very important. And of course, like we can use awards, we can use dedicated funding, so to really incentivize the people who help us spearhead this.
Thanks. There was another question. Yeah.
Hi. We talk about that different people from different backgrounds make different questions, and also we include these who benefits from and who gets impact by research. So I was wondering, in your experience or as a future potential, how much do you see or did you work with including groups of people that don't come from academia backgrounds, but they are in touch and related to the subjects that you are researching, maybe because of a personal background, experience, interest, and what difficulties you see in engaging this group of people in your researches?
So we routinely use patient advisory boards to advise us on the lived experience living with certain chronic conditions or disabilities. As a person who is not having that lived experience, so for example, I've done HIV research with black men who have sex with men. I would never dare to do that without the community members. So, and of course, there are lots of barriers then. We researchers are real nerds, right? We have our special words, we have our, we are often not very accessible in our wording, in our language. So it really, it requires of us to do a lot more than just science communication, but rather really try to become, use essential language, more everyday language, and translate and take this seriously. So by including people with lesser education to also use simplified language and maybe also more visualizations, more videos, and like really to really collaborate with these community groups. I think we've had the experience; it works very well.
May I just add that you're sort of a poster child of all this, and at the Charité, I can tell you that we are not all true to what you're preaching here, so we should do more about that. So the impression that the Charité is just a heaven for all those things is unfortunately not true.
Okay, I will do one more question and then we have to close because we're very close on time.
Okay, so you get the last question.
Thank you. I just want to ask about this language diversity. You know, we have different people with different language, and we still want to get the best, which we are talking of the merit in research. Now we are also talking of the global. Mm-hmm. The global you want to take from Africa, and you also take from maybe Germany here, and the languages are not the same. How do you balance that?
Yeah, so coming from an institute where English is the working language, globally, the German language is a total minority project, yeah? So there isn't any hegemony of the German. So when you're in the global world, it's English basically. Or if you're in the Francophone or like Hispanic areas, it's French or Spanish. So these are the world languages, but actually it's English. So that's basically the answer, and that's where like there should be a statistics on how much worldwide science is published in English. Probably it's like 90% or so.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is also a task for all countries, so to kind of really take. So we are a completely bilingual lab as well, but I encounter a lot of fear often, especially in people, for example, for Eastern Germans, they have learned Russian and they have not, they're not so fluent or in English. Especially the younger ones are usually quite bilingual, but they also takes practice, yeah, and goodwill. So for example, we have policies that every person can speak in their own language, and then either we translate or or it's simply acceptable to not fully understand. Yeah, so.
Before I hand back to Tracey, I have to apologize to those that have not been able to ask their questions and so far not got an answer. We have several questions in the chat still, and I'm sure you have questions here, but you will announce that there are, at least for those here, there are still some ways of getting into the discussion.
Yes, so for those who are staying, we will have some time for you to talk to the speakers afterwards outside a little bit. I would like to thank all of you for joining. I have negative 20 seconds on the clock. So unfortunately, we don't have much of a time for summary, but we hope that this has been an interesting and insightful discussion for all of you, and we would encourage you to talk to the panelists or to reach out to them privately afterwards. And I think the most important thing to learn is that we all have something to learn, and we all have something that we can do to help in this space. And so reflection on what we can do as we move forward is critically important. So thank you to all of our panelists, including our online panelists, and thank you to our audience and our online audience for your excellent questions.